going on, guys? Junior's Fishing Company with a little finesse bait today. Finesse, I would kind of categorize this as a finesse bait. It's a little over 4.5 inches long. It's got a 3/16 ounce. I think this is a Z-Man something. There's so many jig heads out there, especially finesse Ned rigs and all that stuff. It's crazy. I can't remember exactly which one this is, but it's a 3/16. Obviously, this was brown and I painted it white. This is another video that I've made that with the white and the purple. I really liked the other two, and I wanted to downsize that color pattern to something else. And so this is what I ended up with: white, pastel purple, a little bit of flash, a small light bait that you can kind of just drag on the bottom. That's what my intention was with this. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe, go to the channel, leave some comments below of stuff you want to see. Let's tie this thing up. Alright, so with this jig, I want it to be, this is a really small jig. I think it's a 3/16 ounce, and this shank is super long. And so it's meant to have a soft plastic on it. And so I'm not going to really end up using probably half of this shank for anything. I thought about putting a rattle in there, but I ended up not going with it because it's going to be more of a finesse bait, and so I don't think I'm going to need or want that rattle, because I'm only going to put some hackle feathers and 2 stacks of deer hair. Again, I want this bait to be pretty thin. When it's wet, I don't want it to be much thicker than the head of the jig. Sometimes that's what I do when I'm making a finesse bait. I don't want it to be much bigger than the head. So if the head is really, really small, if you're thinking even, a 1/16 ounce jig, that's going to be a really small head. And so you don't want some huge body with a little head. I think it looks kind of goofy. So the first thing I'm going to put is these purple, I think pastel purple and white feathers, and then really just 2 stacks of bucktail. So glue's dry. I'm going to put my first stack down, and then I've got some holographic flashabou that I'm going to put in just a little bit, because again, I want this to be, the colors aren't subtle, but I'm going to fish it pretty finesse-ish, so I don't want to add too much stuff to this. I kind of want to just use the KISS method, keep it simple, stupid, right? So I'm going to go, there's a bad hair in there, I'm going to go pretty far down where just the tips of these feathers are going to be exposed. So I'm going to trim this off just a little bit. And I'm so far up this shank where I'm going to use a lot of this length of this bucktail, because I still want to go relatively far back. I mean, this isn't an 8-inch bait, but I'm going to use quite a bit of this length for this jig. And this is a pretty thin stack of deer hair. Again, I just don't want to overdo it. So I'm just keeping it simple. And then I'm going to put some of this flashabou down, just to add a little bit of flash. Get this cinched down really well. And I don't have to worry about trimming these butts or anything, because I'm going to have plenty of room. For my last stack. So I'm going to get my flashabou, and this is just, with the other 2 videos that I did, it's just silver and light purple holographic flashabou. And I'll probably take, this might be 5 strands, and I'll taper it out a little bit. It's pretty curled. And I'll go This one will go pretty far down. And that next one I might do a little bit shorter. This stuff is pretty curled, I don't know why. Sometimes you get a package of flashabou and it's really curled. It's not my favorite to work with. So I'll just get that spun around and tied down. Then I can trim with my big scissors. Turn this around, and this is going to be kind of the top of my bait. I'm going to fish this on the bottom, so it's really hard to say what's the top and what's the bottom when it's fished on the bottom of the lake. So get that twisted up. I just really like this white and purple. Combination. It's just, I don't know why. I like chartreuse, but I'm just more of a natural. This obviously isn't natural, but I tie a ton of natural stuff and a ton of white and black stuff. Bring it all the way up here. So I don't do a ton of like pinks and purples like this, but white goes with everything. So I'm going to put a little bit of super glue on here just to make sure that tinsel doesn't get pulled out. And I'm going to let that dry, and we'll get our last stack on there. So that first stack had a lot of lavender in it. This one has almost none. And so about, I don't know, a quarter of this bait's going to be a lot of white. And I put more white feathers in the back too. I don't want this bait to necessarily be all purple. I want it to be mostly white with just a little purple in it, because that purple just shows so much more. So it's going to be a little bit trickier to get this spun around, because that jig head's kind of like a 90-degree head, so that makes it just a little bit tougher to get this deer hair spun around, because that deer hair doesn't want to bend like that. You just gotta take your time, comb it out, get it spun around. And I actually used Do It paint and painted this jig white. The pack that these came in, it was actually, I think they were all brown. And so you can get that paint off. You can soak it in thinner or do whatever you want. There's a million ways to do it. But I just dipped it in white a couple times and it just completely covers it. It doesn't really, you can't see any of that brown anymore. So that's the good thing about if you have some paint. I'll buy a jig based on how it looks and the weight rather than having to be picky about the colors. Now if you get a really cool painted jig head or something like that, something with really good eyes, then you're going to want to just keep it as is. But so I'm going to get a couple really good wraps right up to here, and I'll kind of work it back. I got to get my razor blade and we'll trim this up. All right, little 3/16 ounce. I wouldn't necessarily call this as like a super finesse. You know, you've got so many Ned rigs and all these finesse jig heads, and it's crazy what people are using these days, and it's crazy how many options you've got. But I mean, this is kind of just like a classic little jig head. I don't know, maybe you'd call it a Ned rig. Usually think Ned rigs have a flatter on both sides. They're pretty flat, usually just to sit flat on the bottom. And this isn't a 90-degree jig hook. Like I've got one right here. If you look at this is kind of more of like a Ned rig. It's pretty flat on both sides, and it's got that 90-degree eye. I'm gonna tie this in a little bit, but 3/16 is plenty light where I would consider it a pretty good finesse bait. I mean, it's not a 16th ounce, but a really bright finesse bait, because you can throw brown and black all you want, green pumpkin, watermelon, whatever, but every once in a while, you know, it's nice to have something in your arsenal that's a little bit different, but it's still kind of in that category of finesse. And this bait isn't even going to be 5 inches. I mean, it's going to be about 4.5 inches, which is plenty small, especially when this gets wet. It's going to be super thin. You can see when I pull this back, it's going to be really thin. It's going to be thinner than the head of my jig, and that's exactly what I wanted. It's going to be a really long, thin bait. So I'm really excited to use this. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. Thanks for the support. Check out the channel. Leave a comment below, something you want to see. Junior's Fishing Company. See you in the next one.